Hello, archaeology fans. Let's talk about the Amazon. The Amazon is huge. It's 6.7 million square kilometers, and it covers 9 countries. Despite that, it's very uninhabited. There are about 400 indigenous groups in there, but they're very dispersed and they live in very small groups. So for all practical purposes, it's uninhabited by humans right now. 500 years ago, Orellana was the first of the Spanish conquistadors to go all the way through the Amazon from the Andes out to the mouth of the Amazon. And during that voyage, he said that he saw big cities. He was led to places with kings on top of big pyramids, and there were highways that led there and back to the river. Now, since then, we've kind of decided that Orellana was crazy and that it was just myths and stories. That's where we get a lot of the El Dorado stories from. So for centuries, nobody really thought to look in the Amazon. But in the last few decades, we've been finding a lot of evidence of actual large-scale civilization there. So in this video, I want to talk about 4 major areas of the Amazon that I'm looking at as developing evidence of major civilization. The first one is Marajo Island. It's at the mouth of the Amazon. It's an absolutely huge island. In fact, it's the biggest river island in the world. Belgium would fit inside of it. But on that island are a bunch of earthen mounds, some of them really big, 20 meters plus. It was first archaeologically investigated by Betty Meggers in the 1940s. And during her time, she recorded all those big mounds. She also found a lot of really nice pottery. But what she didn't find much of was evidence of agriculture. Instead, they were relying on the ocean and the river coming in, riverine resources, and it was basically aquaculture that they were practicing. Now, back in the 1940s, we didn't have carbon-14, so Betty Meggers didn't know how old it was, but subsequent excavations have shown us that it functioned somewhere between 600 and 1300 CE. At that point, there were still people living there, they just weren't building mounds anymore. So ironically, it was Betty Meggers herself, one of the first archaeologists of the Amazon, that really impeded further studies for a while. She did that by popularizing her theory called the counterfeit paradise. In that theory, she suggested that the Amazon was simply unsuitable for major agriculture, that the soils were bad, it was too difficult with the forest, and that despite the fact that it had such a resource abundance, that paradise, that you couldn't actually plant crops and start a major civilization there, and that's what made it counterfeit. Now, these days, there have been more archaeologists there over the decades, especially Anna Roosevelt, the granddaughter of Teddy Roosevelt, is actually a practicing archaeologist in the Amazon right now. I think that's cool. But we've since discovered that Marajo Island is more than just there. It's also on either side of the river going up and down the coast. It's a major area of more population for a longer period of time than Meggers ever understood. Oh, and one more thing. The same people that made the mounds of Marajo Island were still in the area when Orellana came through, and he records fighting those people. The second area I'd like to highlight is the Beni in Bolivia. It's where the Amazon connects to the eastern side of the Andes, but firmly in the Amazon, very much in the lowlands. That entire area is full of networks of giant mounds with causeways spiraling off of them in a kind of radial pattern, and little mounds all around it. Now, these ruins had been known since the 1970s, but in the 1990s, Clark Erickson started working there. He's an archaeologist from Pennsylvania, and he started recording these mounds and their contents. They were pretty well organized. Big mounds with causeways leading out. Again, The things that we're finding in the Beni are not new. In fact, they were, I think, in chapter 1 of Charles Mann's 1491. He went down there with Erichsen and saw for himself these huge mounds. Now, Erichsen and other colleagues have been at it, continuing to map and understand this area, and it gets larger and larger all the time. I think we're up to 600 plus miles of causeways connecting big and small mounds. It's an absolutely vast area. And the mounds are surrounded by areas of what we call raised fields, places where long rows of jungle muck are piled up, so they make canals in between them, and then you can plant up on top of them. When the rainy season comes in, they don't get completely flooded. They're planting on these raised fields. And in between the fields are fishing weirs. It's a very complex, sophisticated way to both farm and fish in the Amazon, capitalizing on the rainy season rise of water and dry season fall of water. Now, Erichsen discovered, or at least enlightened me, that the Jesuits had seen these communities functioning back in the 1600s. After the Andes had been pretty well conquered and Christianized, they were moving down into the Amazon, trying to change those cultures too. And down in the Beni area, an area called Llano de Mochas by the archaeologists these days, the Jesuits found big, huge communities, tens of thousands of people living on these big mounds as the public sectors, and then the causeways led out to little residential sectors with smaller mounds. But it was a network of roads that was very organized. There was trade, there was parties, there was a political system. Everything was in place when the Jesuits got there. Of course, as usual, when the Europeans show up, that's when things disperse and break up. So it's been sitting there for 500 years under the jungle. But now, starting with the work of Erichsen and continuing with the work of colleagues of mine like Edward Neves, they're finding more and more and more out there in the Beni. So Bolivia, that's the second place. The third place that interests me is the Shingu region of southern Brazil. It's up in a slightly more highland area than the Amazon basin, but it's still part of the Amazon, and it's still very jungle and seasonally inundated. There, we're finding these huge things we call geoglyphs. They're squares, they're circles, they usually have a ditch around them, so there's a place for water to fill in, and the higher parts of their edges were probably where palisade walls went up. But these are big features, and again, they're connected by causeways, they're using raised fields. In many ways, they're just like what Erichsen was finding over in Bolivia, just a slightly different flavor. Now, one of the things they also point out there, which Erichsen found in the Beni as well, is what we call anthropogenic landscapes, or anthropogenic soils on a small scale. What that is the evidence that the earth had been turned over and over and over in those areas by farming, and that it becomes very dark and it's very organic rich. That's the evidence that it wasn't originally forest, or maybe it was originally, but there was a period of time where humans were extensively farming that area. And now the forest that's grown up in the last 500 years is sitting on top of that fertile soil. All around the Amazon, they call that terra preta. The Shingu area has that terra preta and these huge geoglyphs. By the way, this was the area that Percy Fawcett was looking in. There are some big sites there, and perhaps, as he reported, he had seen things on his surveys of the Amazon. That's what made him go back and look for this city. It may well have been some of these big sites being now found in the Shingu region. Oh, and by the way, the Shingu region has a pretty short-lived period in its major architecture phase. And that's basically from about 1200 to 1600. That's not to say there's not older stuff there, but that's what we know. The Beni, if I didn't mention it, was more like 500 to 1500, tagging right at the end where the Jesuits show up. The fourth area I want to talk about is the Upano Valley area of southeastern Ecuador. Now, That's an area that they've found 15 big sites in, and they're very, very different in character. The buildings are not circular. There are not these kind of spiral or radial patterns that we see coming out of the other Amazonian areas. Instead, we have rectangular buildings and we have straight rectilinear roads, big ones that go from one community to another and in a grid pattern within the larger communities. The biggest one's called Quilomope, and it was actually known since the 1970s. And then in the 1990s, a French archaeologist named Stéphane Rostand started mapping there. And he also excavated there, finding that it's actually a little older than most of the other Amazonian communities as well. It goes from about 500 BCE to about 600 CE, so it's earlier, and that's exciting too. The rectangles are very interesting. They look more Andean than they do Amazonian. And it's a very different pattern. They have right in the middle of their communities, they have agricultural terraces and canals that are going through flat agricultural land. So very corn-oriented agricultural people doing it different than the other people in the Amazon. They're using those raised fields, remember, and up here they're using terraces and canals. That's probably because Quilomope sits at about 1,000 feet above sea level, and the lower Amazon is more like 100, 200 feet above. So they've got a different strategy. They don't flood as deeply, and so they had a different kind of agriculture. There are big rectangular buildings that are obviously public in nature, perhaps royal. And then there are lots of small little communities that have rectangular buildings around courtyards. That's again so sophisticated and so different than some of the things in the Amazon. I have hope that this area is really kind of the border between these two cultures, and the interface is seen in the way they do their agriculture and the way they build their buildings. By the way, these are all earthen mounds. Everything in the Amazon is an earthen mound. These are not stone, and some people will always say, well, if it's not stone, it's not a sophisticated building. But I would argue otherwise. There's lots of engineering that goes into these things. Could you make a square of dirt that's still here 1,000 years later? I couldn't. And when it comes to these places in Ecuador, despite archaeologists like Rostand's work through the 70s, 90s, into the early 2000s, it really wasn't until the advent of LiDAR that we could see the exciting pictures. Rostand got a hold of some LiDAR in 2015. I don't know why it took him so long to publish it, but in 2024, he finally did. And the LiDAR maps from above are absolutely amazing. Now we can see, by his reports, there's about 6,000 buildings out there. And there are over 15 sites. 2 of them are very big. Quilomope's the biggest one. Sanjay's the other one. But this is a vast area that we're really just now seeing for what it is. And to me, what's further exciting about that area is what's going on just on the other side of the border in Peru. Now, you know, those are modern countries with modern borders. The ancient people didn't recognize those borders. And it turns out that in the department of Loreto, just across the Ecuadorian border from this Upano Valley area, we have a recent report that says they found 415 additional archaeological sites there. So when we look at the Upano and actually look across that invisible border and see that there are another 415 sites in the area just on the other side, well, we have a lot of work to do there. There's also one other site in that area that excites me. It's just south of those 2 in Peru, and it's called Monte Grande. It's a big old site. They say this one started at about 1,000 BCE, and it's got very different architecture again. It has these spiral patterns on their temples. It looks kind of like the poquillos that the Nazca would make. So a very different thing. I'm not saying that they're Nazca. I'm just saying that form-wise, the spiral reminds me of what was happening way to the south. But it's much earlier than them as well. So if anybody influenced anybody, it was this area in the Amazon. So you might have noticed that all of the sites that I'm talking about right now are all on the periphery of the Amazon. What's going on in the heart of the Amazon? Well, we know there's a lot more to discover there, and there have been steady archaeological projects in there, but they're not very well published or publicized. I went down to the middle of the Amazon in 2017. There's the one city in the middle there called Manaus. It's got 2 million people, I think, and it's right at where the Amazon and the Rio Negro connect and become just the Amazon headed towards the Pacific. So I went there in 2017, and I met with some archaeologists who brought me to some pretty interesting sites with pottery and mounds just across the Amazon, across the bridge from Manaus. We were less than 30 minutes away from the city, and here's already some archaeology. I also took a riverboat up the Rio Negro for a week, and up there I met some of the tribes. And as I went through the normal touristy things with my group, I asked people there, I said, first off, why did you put your village here? And they would say, well, it's because of the terra preta, that black soil, that anthropogenic soil. And so they were looking for places to put their villages that are on top of that black soil. Now, I asked them if they knew that that was put in place by humans way before them, and that sounded like nonsense to them. However, I do think it's interesting that despite why they're doing it, they know that those areas of darker soil are the right ones to put their village on because they have an easier time planting corn there. So in conclusion, where are we with the Amazon and archaeology right now? Well, in the big picture, we're making huge advances. We are finding more and more sites every year, and the big sites that we found, we're investigating those further. But in the little picture, this is going to take a while. It's so exciting that we found all of these sites out on the periphery, but archaeology moves slowly. It's really going to take us decades to get through and really investigate what we've already found. Then there's the matter of the deep, dark interior of the Amazon. We haven't really even started there. Yes, there are projects, but honestly, the farther you get away from civilization, the harder it is to have an archaeological project there. You could go out for a week or two, but you really can't have a sustained project without being at least reasonably adjacent to a major civilization or a place where you can buy groceries and such. So the Amazon, it's really going to go slow. Perhaps someday LiDAR will advance to the point where we can scan the entire 6.7 million square kilometers. But until then, it's a slow process. And how are we going to find any of that stuff in there? Well, in my opinion, the only way that's ever happened is to go respectfully to the groups that actually live in there and ask them where the cool stuff is.